Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today it's come that point every month where I'd like to speak about vintage watches, and indeed the various interesting options which are available on the market in a very wide variety of different price ranges. And today I'd like to speak about everything from a very impressive and extremely well-priced Cetina from the 1970s and 60s with a fantastic history of diving, in addition to a movement which was made by Lemania in the 1940s, which has very much defined the chronograph movement for the last 50 years, in addition to a very interesting Seiko GMT watch, which offers something very different to other options on the market. Now the first piece I'd like to speak about is a piece from Seiko, which is the Seiko Navigator reference 617-64, and then there are the last two digits, which vary depending upon the variant. But this piece is rather an interesting variation on the 6105 movements from Seiko in the 1960s. And these were automatic winding mechanical movements, which really powered a lot of Seiko's greats from that period, such as their 6105 dive watches. However, the 6117 was released in the mid to late 1960s, and came in the form of a GMT version of that famous movement. And this piece was seen in a variety of different Seikos, but I feel the version which offers the best value is the very well-known 6117-64. And this is a watch which comes in this rather interesting tonneau style of case, which is notably smaller and somewhat slimmer than the equivalent dive watch, with a much smaller crown, as you can see. In terms of features though, this is very much a feature-rich model, because it does feature that GMT edition, in addition to the date at 3 o'clock. Of course, Seiko of this period have become very, very well known for their extremely high level of quality where the finishing of the watches is concerned, and this is an area to look for in these pieces and will often define the more expensive variants. And the reason for this is that those which have been polished less will retain most of that rather beautiful Seiko finishing, which creates a very interesting sheen on the surface of the metal, and generally creates a more desirable timepiece. Though that said, I would say that any of these pieces in decent condition are something to treasure, really, because there are less and less really in good condition, especially as moisture affects more and more of these watches which are ill-maintained. Where the dials of these watches are concerned, you get this fantastic matte black dial with an applied Seiko logo, in addition to automatic navigation timer on the dial. You also get a faceted date window, in addition to that rotating 24-hour Pepsi style of bezel, which rotates around the inside of the dial and provides you with this rather interesting readout, which means the watch remains quite slim, and indeed quite dress-like in terms of not having an external bezel, but still retains the functionality of a 24-hour graduated bezel. Then you also do have a red GMT hand, which you'll notice is slightly raised at its tip to clear those indices, which is a very nice touch and I think matches the faceted and polished hands beautifully. Of course, the movement is very much the centrepiece of this watch, and comes in the form of the 6117. And as I've said, this is based on the architecture of the 6105. However, in this case, still features 17 joules and runs at 3 Hz, and doesn't feature hacking either. But it does still feature the date, which is of course a key function for a GMT timepiece, and of course that GMT function. In addition to that, it is automatic, of course, and one should note with these movements that well maintained, these will last an extremely long time. Really, the areas where there's a great deal of weakness in these movements is around the spring barrel, regarding their mountings, and so these things should really be checked when you buy the watch by a reputable watchmaker or service centre. But generally these are easily serviced movements in terms of finding someone who will have parts for these, which is very reassuring, especially when buying something which will cost between £350 and £500. However, I feel for this sort of price you get such an impressive package in terms of getting something which is very much of that first wave of GMT watches in the 1960s, which creates a very interesting history to this watch, and I think makes it all the more appealing. The next watch I'd like to speak about is an almost completely unknown model from Cetina. And to put things into context, Cetina are very, very well known to the present day produce a very impressive range of dive watches. However, they've become very well known for their DS range of dive watches, such as the original DS, the DS2 and the DS3. And these saw some very impressive models released, such as models used on the Tektite missions which tested experimental diving, in addition to 1,000-metre versions of their watches such as the DS2 and DS3. However, the version I'd like to speak about today is the Argonaut 200-metre. And there was also the Argonaut 220-metre version. However, the Argonaut 200-metre is more affordable firstly, and also more easily found. But these come in the form of a relatively unknown and very limited, in terms of documentation, relative of those DS dive watches. And it has a very clear Cetina identity to it, with a really beautiful level of finishing and detailing throughout the case and the dial alike, with an interesting movement as well. But starting with the case, this 200-metre version features a 39mm by 41.5mm case, And so this means you get a relatively modern size, albeit with very stubby lugs, which means it should fit the vast majority of wrists without any sort of trouble. The case finishing is also rather beautiful, because one has this cushion-shaped case with rounded edges along the side of the case, and then more sharp and harshly cut edges on the tips of the lugs. And in addition to a sunburst brushed finish and polished areas, this creates a very interesting and highly reflective design, which I think catches the light very well, and also creates a timeless sort of aesthetic. On the side of the case, there's an unguarded but very heavily sunken crown, which is signed with the Certina logo, which also matches the applied logo on the dial, which is placed above the Certina branding automatic Argonaut and 200 meters, with Swiss made at the bottom of the dial. One also sees very beautifully applied and polished indices around the dial, as well as this fantastic orange band around the very edge of the dial, creating this very 70s form to this watch, which generally come from the late 1960s. One also sees a very bright orange minute hand, as well as a white hour hand, which were very much the norm for these professional dive watches of the period, in terms of creating a very highly legible difference between the two. And these, I think, build what is a really wonderful option for someone who wants a vintage-style dive watch, without spending too much money, but also being able to get a great deal for their money. Running around the edge of that beautifully bubble-domed acrylic crystal, and of course around the edge of that dial, is a bezel insert which is finished in Bakelite, and this means that you get this wonderful style of semi-transparent or at least translucent finish to it, with a fully graduated run around its edge, with those each 5-minute marker graduated with a numeral. One also has what would originally have been a luminous plot at 12 o'clock, and very fine knurlings which raise the bezel off the rest of the case, but also prevent it from catching on any sort of cuff. And then, as if to top off this rather beautiful example of late 1960s dive watches, one has a movement which fits into the Cetina line of watches very, very well, which was the movement which was the reference 25-651. And this automatic movement, which is very beautifully finished, with a great deal of decoration, which is abnormal for the period on a dive watch of this sort, is seen, of course, behind a solid case back, guaranteeing those 200 meters of water resistance. But also, this was the same movement used in a great deal of their DS line of extreme dive watches, which adds a bit of history to it, and a little bit of heritage. And so, pricing-wise, these fluctuate enormously as a result of the fact that one doesn't see them appear on the market very often. But generally one sees them between about £500 and £1,100, which I think is a very reasonable price to pay for something of such beauty and of such interest in terms of its details and its history. The following piece I'd like to speak about is not so much a noteworthy timepiece, but rather a very noteworthy and very historically important movement. And this is the IWC Calibre 89, a movement with an incredibly long life, running from 1946 to 1979. And the movement was produced as a result of Albert Peloton joining IWC in 1944, and so released this as his first movement in 1946. And it was designed to be a manually wound movement capable of running 3 hands accurately and reliably. And I feel the design for this movement has really famously designed and driven some of the most important IWC models of the 20th century. Of course, famously, this movement was used in the IWC Mark 11, which is defined military pilots' watches of the post-war period, which is certainly not some mean feat, and so as a result, this movement has played a very major role in world history. Above all, this is a very technologically impressive movement in terms of being an exercise in reliability and durability. Now, at base, this is a 17-joule movement that runs at 18,000 vibrations per hour and has a 36-hour power reserve. It's designed, of course, to be manually wound, and uses a very traditional architecture of bridges in separate parts, a number of cocks as well, to hold both the balance in addition to the escape wheel. But it's really the detailing that shows the care taken with this movement, as each of these bridges have been pinned with very large pins in order to reduce the risk of shock, also with extended threads on their screws to again further the holding together of the movement, with very thick and very beautifully beveled bridges to again resist any sort of damage they might suffer over the years. The movement also features clever innovations, like the fact that the spring that holds the second hand and prevents it from jittering around the dial, which is something you'll notice on a lot of vintage watches where this spring has been damaged over the years, is not placed vertically but rather horizontally. And the elegant beauty of this is that when you press a new hand in, for example after servicing the dial or taking the whole watch apart, on a lot of vintage watches this bends the spring out of place and means that you get a very loose second hand. By contrast to that, the fact that this is mounted horizontally, not vertically, in this watch means that you don't get this problem over the years, which is a clever solution to an existing problem. But what I feel is most impressive about this is that despite the fact that there are some versions, and very rare versions at that, which will sell for several £1,000s, and indeed the higher thousands if one looks at the pricing, if one's simply looking for a steel model, or one with an 18-karat gold case, in a relatively conservative style of dress format with 3 hands, the pricing is very impressive for this historical movement. Now, for a steel version, you'll really be looking at between £800 and £1,200, which I think for a beautiful dial with applied indices, beautifully cut hands, and invariably very high-quality builds, this is very impressive. The price for a gold version is also very impressive too, because you can get one for between about £1,800 and £3,000, with some rare pink gold versions going for £4,000 for example, but this still is a very reasonable price for something which really did define history and define IWC as a brand. And so as a result of this, I think it's difficult to view these watches as anything other than extremely good value for what they offer, in terms of something which is really a piece of history, but also a piece of history which you can live with a reliable movement and a beautiful design. Like that IWC Calibre 89 I mentioned earlier, this penultimate piece is also a movement. However, it offers something very different to the 89. Instead of being a very long-lasting movement which offered a very reliable but somewhat simple timekeeping option, this is a movement which offers a far more extravagant set of features, but also played an incredibly important role in the history of the chronograph. Because this is the Lemania 2310 and the 2510. Of course, it's relatively fair to assume that fairly few people will be particularly familiar with these references of movements. However, I feel if I name them by their other names, people might recognise them a bit more. And these other names are the Patek Philippe 2872, and even more famously the Omega Calibre 321. Because yes, this Lemania movement, which was released in 1942 after being tested and developed in the early 40s, was the movement which took Omega to the moon. Of course, mechanically this movement is an absolute legend. Now the movement is of course manually wound from this period because the first of the automatic chronographs only came out in 1969, so almost 30 years after this movement was originally conceived, which I suppose does put this into context. But it is interesting to consider the fact that this movement is really a pinnacle of quality where chronograph movements came. And they're movements which are, of course, built around the architecture we now recognise from Omega, but nonetheless their architecture is a very serviceable form, and this is something they're very well known for being extremely durable and very well conceived to be able to give you a reliability, but also a watchmaker's charm, really, in terms of being a movement which is easily serviced by a good watchmaker, and a movement which is praised, I feel, for its durability and just the fact that it was so well conceived for its period. Now, of course, this is a movement which was developed over the years, and even from Lemania there are really two variants, being the 2310 and the 2510, and the only difference really is that the 2310 has 2 subdials with the running seconds and the chronograph minutes, whilst the 2510 also has the chronograph 12 hours. Of course, whilst running at a slightly lower beat rate than we would normally expect today, it was still a movement which was used extensively by a lot of brands, such as I've said, Patek Philippe, but also it was used in a slightly more heavily jewelled form with a swan neck regulator by Vacheron Constantin and Breguet as well. And so this does demonstrate just the importance of this movement historically. But I feel with the Lemania the interesting thing is you're getting the original sort of form of this movement, and the origin really of all of these very important and very interesting variations. Now the movement itself, though, in its basic form still features a great deal of complication in terms of having interesting features, because for example it features a screwed and weighted balance so that you can regulate it more accurately, but also it features that column wheel to engage the chronograph, which is something of a more subtle approach and something of a more perhaps a more refined approach than the following cam systems used on Lemania movements after this movement. But the reason why I'd like to speak about this movement today, and why I'd like to suggest it as a really fantastic option in vintage watches, is because it's a piece which is far more affordable than you would expect. Now, whereas to get a steel Omega Seamaster, and not talking about a Speedmaster now, just a Seamaster for example, with a 321 calibre nowadays in steel will cost you upwards of £3,500 and more likely £4,500 for one in decent condition. Likewise, buying a Patek Philippe with one of these movements will be an astronomical sum of money. Whereas these pieces, if you go for a dress watch with tachymeter and a rather attractive cream or silver dial with layered and levelled subdials, as well as applied numerals and rather beautiful hands, you can pay for an 18-karat solid gold piece between £1,500 and £2,000, which is quite a remarkable difference in price. And so given this pricing, bearing in mind the fact that an equivalent watch from Omega would cost £4,500 realistically, and in gold realistically a great deal more than that as well, makes these pieces an exceptional option if you want something of high value, but also something of really beautiful design and quality, which is something you can rely on for years to come. And some details about these watches which are frustrations are the fact that a lot of their crowns and pushers will be plated metal, but I think this is a very small price to pay for a really beautiful package with quite a remarkable timepiece and an incredible movement. Now for this final piece, I'd like to address the Rolex market. And it's no secret that the Rolex market is going up in price every year, with vintage models becoming more and more sought after. And there are still some pieces though which remain untapped in terms of their contribution to history and also to the brand. And I feel the Rolex 1501 is very much an example of this. Now the 1501 is the 34mm version of the Oyster Perpetual date, and as a result is a sort of a similar counterpart to the Datejust. And this piece was produced between 1963 and 1980, and so it allows you to enjoy a much older period of vintage Rolex than would normally be the case at an affordable price. Of course, the first element to address really with these watches is the size, because these are a smaller size of 34mm. However, I feel this isn't too much of a problem because the size difference between this and the 36mm Datejust is very much negligible. One really can't notice the difference very easily, and especially with the more pronounced bezel on these pieces, it's a very negligible point and something which I think could be disregarded quite easily. But the details these watches have which are rather unique come in the form of that bezel, which resembles some of the Thunderbird-style chronograph bezels used by Rolex on their Datejust models. However, I do rather like the way that it has those two markers at 12 and is graduated every hour with these fine knurlings and cuts into its surface, which creates a wonderful aesthetic and something distinctly 60s. One also sees a variety of different dials in this sunburst effect, with the most common versions being the black and sort of anthracite colours, in addition to creams and silvers, in addition to some blues as well, which provide a slightly more different and altogether more bold appearance to the watch. It is undoubtedly true though that these pieces are very much elements of the Datejust line, with those beautiful applied indices which come in different forms and different lengths depending upon the version and the year, but one still retains the date at 3 o'clock which is magnified by a Cyclops lens, in addition to that beautifully cut and also very nicely curved style to the second hand, in addition to those faceted straight hands with a counterweight, which adds to the delicate nature of these watches, but also the classic Rolex form and elegance which really doesn't leave these watches. Of course, the watch also features the iconic Rolex Oyster case, with the brushed tops to the lugs and polished sides, in addition to a screw-down crown. The movement inside this watch is also significantly important to the Rolex brand, and this is the Calibre 1570. This was used quite extensively through the 1960s and 70s in a great deal of their watches, and provided very much this particular wave of automatic perpetual movements. And of course they were then replaced by the 3000 line, which we currently still have today, albeit in a very heavily modified form. But these mark very much the end of that era, which is quite interesting to see in a watch, and certainly these are very serviceable movements. They have 26 jewels, are shock resistant, and of course are adjusted to 5 positions and to temperature. These watches also can be tuned in to be able to provide a very high level of accuracy as a result of having screwed balances, which allow you to vary the inertia on the balance wheel in order to then enable the movement to run at a particular beat rate, and thus be able to regulate it more accurately than simply by changing the length of the spring. The final real beauty about these watches is the fact that for the same price as a 1601 Datejust, for example, on a leather strap, you're able to get one of these on an original bracelet, and these are beautifully riveted pieces, admittedly with folded links, but with that traditional charm to these old Rolex bracelets with those rivets and those side sections which fill out the individual links. And whilst this may seem like a small detail, as a result of the fact that these watches were generally worn more delicately than their sports watch counterparts, they tend to be in much better condition. And so really for £2,000 you're able to get a very decent example on a bracelet in steel, whilst £3,500 can get you an 18-karat gold version in pink or yellow gold. And so I'll conclude the video there, but do tell me in the comments down below what you thought of this video, and also of my choices, because there are a few variations in terms of what I'm looking at today, whether it's a movement or a particular reference of watch. And so do tell me in the comments down below which was your favourite, and which you find the most interesting. And so if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos and content here in the future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.